The Buddha and his Dhamma, from ethics to enlightenment. The course of spiritual training taught by the Buddha is a double process of self-transformation and self-transcendence, issuing in complete emancipation from suffering. The process of self-transformation involves the elimination of unwholesome mental dispositions and their replacement by pure dispositions conducing to the benefit of oneself and others. The process of self-transcendence focuses on the abandoning of egocentric notions by seeing with direct insight the essenceless nature of the bodily and mental processes we normally take to be I and mine. When this double process is brought to its culmination, suffering is extinguished, for with the awakening of wisdom, the basic root of suffering, craving backed by blinding ignorance, falls away never to rise again. Because the unwholesome tendencies and selfish clinging spring from seeds buried deep in the bottommost strata of the mind, to eradicate these sources of affliction and nurture the growth of the liberating vision of reality, the Buddha presents his teaching in the form of a gradual training. Buddhist discipline involves gradual practice and gradual attainment. It does not burst into completeness at a stroke, but like a tree or any other living organism, it unfolds organically as a sequence of stages in which each stage rests upon its predecessor as its indispensable foundation and gives rise to its successor as its natural consequent. The principal stages of this gradual training are three: the training in sila, or virtue, the training in samadhi, or concentration, and the training in panya, or wisdom. If we follow through the comparison of the Buddhist discipline to a tree, faith, sada, would be the seed, for it is faith that provides the initial impulse through which the training is taken up, and faith again that nourishes the training through every phase of its development. Virtue would be the roots, for it is virtue that gives grounding to our spiritual endeavors, just as the roots give grounding to a tree. Concentration would be the trunk, the symbol of strength, non-vacillation, and stability. And wisdom would be the branches, which yield the flowers of enlightenment and the fruits of deliverance. The vigor of the spiritual life, like the vigor of a tree, depends upon healthy roots. Just as a tree with weak and shallow roots cannot flourish but will grow up stunted, withered, and barren, so a spiritual life devoid of strong roots will also have a stunted growth, incapable of bearing fruit. To attempt to scale the higher stages of the path, it is essential at the outset to nourish the proper roots of the path. Otherwise, the result will be frustration, disillusionment, and perhaps even danger. The roots of the path are the constituents of sila, the factors of moral virtue. These are the basis for meditation, the ground for all wisdom and higher achievement. To say that sila is the precondition for success, however, does not mean, as is too often believed in conservative Buddhist circles, that one cannot begin to meditate until one's sila is perfect. Such a stipulation would make it almost impossible to start meditation, since it is the mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom of the meditative process that bring about the gradual purification of virtue. But to say that virtue is the basis of practice does mean that the capacity for achievement in meditation hinges upon the purity of our sila. If our roots of virtue are weak, our meditation will likewise be weak. If our actions repeatedly clash with the basic principles of right conduct, our attempts to control the mind in the discipline of meditation will turn into a self-defeating enterprise, since the springs of our conduct will be the same defiled states of mind the meditation is intended to eliminate. Only when we secure our cultivation upon the foundation of blameless principles of right action can the inward endeavor of meditation prosper and issue in success. With true principles of conduct as the base, the roots of virtue will give birth to the trunk of concentration. The concentrated mind shoot forth the branches of wisdom, and the branches of wisdom yield the flowers and fruits of enlightenment, culminating in total freedom from bondage. Therefore, just as a skillful gardener brings a sapling to growth by first tending to the roots, so the earnest seeker of enlightenment should begin his cultivation by tending to the roots of his practice, that is, to his sila or moral virtue. The Pali word sila originally meant simply conduct, but in the context of the Buddhist spiritual training, the term is used to signify only a specific kind of conduct, that is, good conduct, and by an extension of meaning, the type of character for which such conduct stands, that is, good character. Hence, sila means both moral conduct, a body of habits governed by moral principles, and moral virtue, the interior quality the regular observance of these principles is intended to produce. Both shades of meaning are essential to understand the place of sila in the spectrum of Buddhist discipline. Sila, in the former sense, consists in the non-transgression through body or speech of the basic precepts regulating the moral life. It is moral discipline in deed and word, beginning as the inhibition of immoral impulses seeking an outlet through body and speech, and developing into the habitual conformation to the principles of righteous conduct. But the full range of sila is not exhausted by mere outward behavioral control, for the term has in addition a deeper, more psychological significance. In this second sense, sila is moral purity, the inner purification of character which results from a life consistently molded upon moral principles. This aspect of sila places the stress on the subjective, motivational side of action. It looks not towards the outward act itself, but towards the rectitude of mind from which good conduct springs. Upon inspection, sila thus reveals itself to be a two-dimensional quality. It contains an external dimension consisting in purification of conduct and an internal dimension consisting in purification of character. However, in the teaching of the Buddha, these two dimensions of experience, the internal and the external, are not torn apart and consigned to separate, self-sufficient domains. They are recognized, rather, to be two facets of a single whole, complementary poles of a unified field which mirror one another, implicate one another, and penetrate one another with their own respective potentialities of influence. Actions performed by body and speech are not, from the Buddhist standpoint, so many detachable appendages of a distinct spiritual essence, but concrete revelations of the states of mind which stand behind them as their activating source. And states of mind, in turn, do not remain closed up in a purely mental isolation, but spill forth according to the play of circumstances from the fountain of consciousness where they arise, through the channels of body, speech, and thought, out into the world of interpersonally significant events. From the action we can infer the state of mind, and from the state of mind we can predict the probable course of action. The relationship between the two is as integral as that between a musical score and its orchestrated performance on the concert stage. Because of this mutual dependence of the two domains, moral conduct and purity of character lock up with one another in a subtle and complex interrelationship. The fulfillment of the purification of virtue requires that both aspects of sila be realized. On the one side, behavior of body and speech must be brought into accord with the moral ideal. On the other, the mental disposition must be cleansed of its corruptions until it is impeccably pure. The former without the latter is insufficient. The latter without the former is impossible. Between the two, the internal aspect is the more important from the standpoint of spiritual development, since bodily and verbal deeds acquire ethical significance primarily as expressions of a corresponding disposition of mind. In the sequence of spiritual training, however, it is moral discipline that comes first. For at the beginning of training, Purification of character stands as an ideal which must be reached. It is not a reality with which one can start. According to the Buddhist principle of conditionality, the actualization of any given state is only possible through the actualization of its appropriate conditions, and this applies as much to the achievement of the various stages of the training as to the bare phenomena of matter and mind. Since beginningless time, the consciousness continuum has been corrupted by the unwholesome roots of greed, hatred, and delusion. It is these defilements which have functioned as the source for the greatest number of our thoughts, the ground for our habits, and the springs for our actions, and general orientation towards other people and the world as a whole. To uproot these defiling afflictions at a single stroke and reach the peak of spiritual perfection by a mere act of will is a well near impossible task. A realistic system of spiritual training must work with the raw material of human nature. It cannot rest content merely with postulated paragons of human excellence or demands for achievement without showing the method by which such demands can be realized. The Buddha rests his teaching upon the thesis that with the right method, we have the capacity to change and transform ourselves. We are not doomed to be forever burdened by the weight of accumulated tendencies, but through our own effort we can cast off all these tendencies and attain a condition of complete purity and freedom. When given the proper means in the context of right understanding, we can bring about radical alterations in the workings of consciousness and mold a new shape out of the seemingly immutable stuff of our own minds. The first step on this path is the purification of character, and the efficient means for the restructuring of character the Buddha provides in the observance of sila as a set of precepts regulating bodily and verbal conduct. Sila, as moral discipline, in other words, becomes the means for inducing sila as moral virtue. The effectiveness of this measure stems from the reciprocal interlocking of the internal and external spheres of experience already referred to. Because the inner and outer domains are mutually implicated, the one can become the means for producing deep and lasting changes in the other. Just as a state of mind expresses itself outwardly in an action, in deed, or speech, so too the avoidance and performance of certain actions can recoil upon the mind and alter the basic disposition of the mental life. If mental states dominated by greed and hatred can engender deeds of killing, stealing, lying, etc., then the abstinence on principle from killing, stealing, and lying can engender a mental disposition towards kindliness, contentment, honesty, and truthfulness. Thus, although sila as moral purity may not be the starting point of spiritual training, conformity to righteous standards of conduct can make it an attainable end. The medium which bridges the two dimensions of sila, facilitating the translation of outward behavior into inner purity, is volition or satana. Volition is a mental factor common to every occasion of experience, a universal concomitant of every act of consciousness. It is the factor which makes experience teleological, that is, oriented to a goal, since its specific function is to direct its associated factors towards the attainment of a particular end. All action, the Buddha teaches, is in essence volition, for the act itself is from the ultimate standpoint a manifestation of volition through one of the three doors of action: body, speech, or mind. It is volition, bhikkhus, that I call action, for having willed, one performs an action through body, speech, or mind. Volition determines an action as being of a definite sort, and thence imparts to action its moral significance. But since volition is invariably present in every state of consciousness, it is in its own nature without ethical distinctiveness. Volition acquires its distinctive ethical quality from certain other mental factors known as roots, mula, in association with which it always arises on occasions of active experience. Roots are of two morally determinate kinds: unwholesome, akusala, and wholesome, kusala. The unwholesome roots are greed, hatred, and delusion. The wholesome roots are non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion. These latter, though expressed negatively, signify not merely the absence of the defiling factors, but the presence of positive moral qualities as well: generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom, respectively. When volition is driven by the unwholesome roots of greed, hatred, and delusion, it breaks out through the doors of the body and speech in the form of evil deeds, as killing, stealing, and fornication, as lying, slander, harsh speech, and gossip. In this way, the inner world of mental defilement darkens the outer world of spatio-temporal extension. But the defiled trend of volitional movement, though strong, is not irrevocable. Unwholesome volition can be supplanted by wholesome volition, and thence the entire disposition of the mental life made subject to a reversal at its foundation. This redirecting of volition is initiated by voluntarily undertaking the observance of principles of conduct belonging to a righteous order, by willing to abstain from evil and to practice the good. Then, when volition tending to break out as evil action is restrained and replaced by volition of the opposite kind, by the will to behave virtuously in word and deed, a process of reversal will have been started which, if followed through, can produce far-reaching alterations in the moral tone of character. For acts of volition do not spend their full force in their immediate exercise, but rebound upon the mental current which gave birth to them, reorienting that current in the direction towards which they point as their own immanent tendency. The unwholesome volitions towards moral deprivation, and the wholesome volitions towards moral purification. Each time, therefore, an unwholesome volition is supplanted by its wholesome opposite, the will to the good is strengthened. A process of factor substitution, built upon the law that incompatible mental qualities cannot be simultaneously present on a single occasion of experience, then completes the transformation through the efficacy of the associated roots. Just as unwholesome volitions invariably arise in association with the unwholesome roots, with greed, hatred, and delusion, so do wholesome volitions inevitably bring along with them as their concomitants the wholesome roots of non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion. Since opposite qualities cannot coexist, the replacement of unwholesome volition by wholesome volition at the same time means the transposition of the unwholesome and the wholesome roots. Continually called into play by the surge of volition, the wholesome roots perfume the mental stream with the qualities for which they stand, with generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. And these, as they gather cumulative force, come to prominence as regular propensities of the personality, eclipsing the inclination towards the unwholesome. In this way, the exercise of wholesome volitions on repeated and varied occasions effects a transformation of character from its initial moral susceptibility to a pitch of purity where even the temptation to evil remains at a safe remove. Though volition or satana is the primary instrument of change, the will in itself is indeterminate and requires specific guidelines to direct its energy towards the actualization of the good. A mere good will, from the Buddhist standpoint, is altogether inadequate, for despite the nobility of the intention, as long as the intelligence of the agent is clouded with the dust of delusion, the possibility always lies open that laudable motives might express themselves in foolish or even destructive courses of action. This has been the case often enough in the past, and still stands as the perennial bugbear of the ethical generalist. According to the Buddhist outlook, goodness of will must be translated into concrete courses of action. It must be regulated by specific principles of right conduct, principles which, though flexible in their application, possess normative validity independently of any historical culture or existing scheme of values, entirely by virtue of their relation to a universal law of moral retribution and their place in the timeless path of practice, leading to deliverance from suffering and the samsaric round. To guide the will in its aspiration for the good, the Buddha has prescribed in definite and lucid terms the factors of moral training which must be fulfilled to safeguard progress along the path to enlightenment. These factors are comprised in the 3 items which make up the aggregate of virtue in the Noble Eightfold Path, namely right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Right speech is the avoidance of all harmful forms of speech, the abstinence from falsehood, slander, harsh speech, and idle chatter. The speech of the aspirant must be constantly truthful, conducive to harmony, gentle, and meaningful. Right action applies a brake upon unwholesome bodily action by prescribing abstinence from the destruction of life, from stealing, and from sexual misconduct. The latter means incelibacy in the case of monks, and adultery and other illicit relations in the case of householders. The behavior of the aspirant must always be compassionate, honest, and pure. And right livelihood requires the avoidance of trades which inflict harm and suffering upon other living beings, such as dealing in meat, slaves, weapons, poisons, and intoxicants. Avoiding such harmful trades, the noble disciple earns his living by a peaceful and righteous occupation. The training factors embedded in these components of the Noble Eightfold Path simultaneously inhibit the base, ignoble, and destructive impulses of the human mind and promote the performance of whatever is noble and pure. Though worded negatively in terms of the types of conduct they are intended to shut out, they are positive in effect, for when adopted as guidelines to action, they stimulate the growth of healthy mental attitudes which come to expression as beneficent courses of conduct. Intensively, these training rules reach into the recesses of the mind, blunt the force of unwholesome volition, and redirect the will to the attainment of the good. Extensively, they reach into the commotion of man's social existence, and arrest the tide of competition, exploitation, grasping, violence, and war. In their psychological dimension, they confer mental health. In their social dimension, they promote peace. In their spiritual dimension, they serve as the irreplaceable foundation for all higher progress along the path to emancipation. Regularly undertaken and put into practice, they check all mental states rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion, promote actions rooted in non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion, and lead to a life of charity, love, and wisdom. From this, it will be seen that, from the Buddhist point of view, formulated rules of conduct are not superfluous accessories to a good will, but necessary guidelines to right action. They are an essential part of the training, and when implemented by the force of volition, become a fundamental means to purification. Especially in the context of the practice of meditation, the training precepts prevent the eruption of defiled actions destructive to the purpose of the meditative discipline. By following carefully the prescribed rules of conduct, we can rest assured that we are avoiding at least the coarser expressions of greed, hatred, and delusion, and that we will not have to face the obstacle of guilt, anxiety, and restlessness that comes in the trail of regular moral transgressions. If we return to our earlier comparison of the Buddhist discipline to a tree and take virtue to be the roots, then the principles of right conduct become the soil in which the roots grow. Just as the soil contains the nutritive essences required for the tree to sprout and flourish, so do the precepts contain the nutriment of purity and virtue required for the growth of the spiritual life. The precepts embody the natural conduct of the arahant or perfected saint. For the arahant, His conduct flows outward as the spontaneous expression of his innate purity. By his very nature, all his deeds are flawless, free from blemish. He cannot follow any course of action motivated by desire, ill will, delusion, or fear, not through any forced conformity to rules, but by the very law of his being. The worldling, however, is not immune from the possibility of immoral conduct. To the contrary, because the unwholesome roots remain firmly planted in the makeup of his mind, he is constantly prone to the temptation to moral transgression. He is liable to kill, steal, commit adultery, lie, drink, etc. And in the absence of any sound moral code prohibiting such actions, he will often succumb to these liabilities. Hence the necessity of providing him with a set of ethical principles built upon the pillars of wisdom and compassion, by which he can regulate his actions and conform to the natural, spontaneous behavior of the liberated one. A precept is, therefore, from the Buddhist perspective, much more than a prohibition imposed upon conduct from without. Each precept is a tangible expression of a corresponding attitude of mind, a principle which clothes in the form of concrete action a beam of the light of inward purity. The precepts render visible the invisible state of purification. They make it accessible to us by refracting it through the media of body and speech into specific rules of conduct we can apply as guides to action when we find ourselves in the diverse situations they are designed to cover. By bringing our conduct into harmony with the precepts, we can nourish the root of our spiritual endeavors, our virtue. And when virtue is made secure, the succeeding stages of the path unfold spontaneously through the law of the spiritual life, culminating at the crest in the perfection of knowledge and the serene azure of deliverance. As the Master says, "For one who is virtuous, bhikkhus, endowed with virtue, no deliberate volition need be exerted. Let freedom